Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, 2021 ICS OT Year in Review Executive Briefing, sponsored by Dragos. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speaker is Robert M. Lee, SANS Senior Instructor and Dragos CEO and co-founder. If during the webcast you have any questions for Robert, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for reviewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Robert.
All right, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining. I know there are plenty of things going on in the world these days, but I wanted to be able to share our annual year in review report with you and what's going on with key insights to drive your security efforts forward this next year. As a bit of introduction for those of you that don't know me, my name is Robert Lee. I'm the CEO and co-founder over at Dragos. We're an industrial cybersecurity technology and services firms. In addition to that, I'm also a course author and senior instructor at SANS. I authored the ICS 515 class, which is all about how to monitor and respond to threats in industrial networks, and authored the 578 class, which is all about cyber threat intelligence and learning how to become a good intel analyst. So today, though, of course, I'll have my Dragos hat on, although for everything I get involved in, I try to treat it as an educational moment. But we'll go ahead and kick right off. So what you will see in today's presentation is really some of the highlights from our fifth year's year in review. So every year, we try to compile all these insights together that we take from doing incident response cases, pen tests, assessments, look at our technology customers in terms of what we can see based on what they're experiencing, and our managed service customers. And we just try to compile everything together to be a data-driven kind of ground truth reality of the world of industrial cyber. When I started my career and got into ICS security, there was a lot of anecdotes, what we call kind of tummy feel, just saying, oh, I think this is what we should do. There was a lot of copy and pasting IT security stuff into OT for no other reason than the fact that it didn't break the SCADA server, not because we had reduced risk. So there's a lot of just anecdotes and myths and secret databases and all sorts of discussions. So when we started Dragos, the idea was, let's just take our point of view, our reference, our scope of influence, take all of our insights and just make them free and public every year, so the community can start to get to a baseline of what's actually happening, not anecdotal, not somebody had an idea, but what are we seeing really work and not work, and trying to share those insights out. So it's really a good document. I think this year's is like a 65-page report. It is packed very well. You can go get the report at dragos.com/YIR, so like year in review, YIR. But if you hit the Dragos website up, you'll see all that. And then after this presentation, this is the kind of the executive, hey, here's the overview. Over on the Dragos website, you'll see that there's actually multiple webcasts coming up, deep diving into each area. So a deep dive on the threats, a deep dive on the lessons learned from our services teams, a deep dive on vulnerabilities. Today, though, going through some of the most important highlights and walking you through kind of what our experience has been over the last year. And of course, feel free to ask questions. There's the Q&A button on Zoom. I'll answer the questions as we go through this and try to make sure to hit on your topics. So right off the top, we need to look at just some of the big headlines of last year. It was a pretty packed year, and I think some of the things that took place really went without a whole lot of discussion. Obviously, there was big discussions on things like Colonial Pipeline, but there was some really good actions last year as well. The U.S. government did quite a few good actions last year. But the one that really started off the year, something I think didn't get as much coverage as it really deserved, was the Oldsmar water system hack. So why I say it didn't get as much coverage as it should is, for a long time, various policy members, executives, others have looked at the cybersecurity problem and said, yeah, well, it's probably really not going to manifest on our soil. Speaking from a US centric mindset, this idea, of course, there's risk and you got to do something, but who would ever actually try to hurt people through cyber? What happened with Oldsmar is somebody remotely tried to take advantage of the system there, tried to pour extra amounts of lye into the water system, which would have absolutely hurt people. And luckily, an operator just seeing the mouse move on the screen was able to get in the way of that. Of course, we don't want to have to rely on somebody watching the screen to see a mouse move, but it's really good work on the Oldsmar facility staff for being able to see that and make sure no one was ever at risk, and to make sure that things were taken care of. But the point is not what happened with it. The point is an attack on operation systems of somebody trying to abuse native functionality and trying to hurt people on American soil, that is a conversation that got more traction and discussions going in the policy side of the House and Congress and similar than I think than it did in the cybersecurity community. A lot of the cybersecurity community commentary I saw was, well, it's just TeamViewer. Of course you could do that. I think the technical sophistication of things is missing the point. The point is usually the impact to the public, the action, the intent of an adversary. Those things are much more concerning at times. Of course, last year, ransomware kind of reigned in terms of the discussions. We've been seeing this now for a while. Human-operated ransomware cases have led to an explosion in ransomware cases across the world. And we end up doing instant response to a lot more ransomware cases than ever get public. But what I'll note is that the common theme there is a lot of these operations, technology, industrial environments are way more connected than people realize. We know they are connected, but it turns out you're often connected to integrators and original equipment manufacturers and maintenance personnel and remote workers and so forth and so on. And there's just more and more and more connectivity coming every year in these sites. And that's leading to access points for adversaries like ransomware groups. And if you just put your efforts on IT security, thinking you got to go through IT to get to OT, you're missing it, because you probably will go through IT to get to OT. It's not always required. You'll probably go through IT to get to OT, but it doesn't have to be your IT. Oftentimes it's your providers and supply chain and so forth. What I will highlight again as well is some of the ransomware groups very commonly target industrial systems, regardless of their public rhetoric. And we'll talk about those trends and what those groups are later. But what I'll highlight here is there seems to be a pretty clear indication that ransomware groups recognize that by targeting OT systems, that they are able to get higher payments faster. So in our analysis, it's not a ransomware group trying to take down a pipeline, trying to take down an electric generation site, trying to take down a renewable energy site. It's much more of the adversaries realizing if they get to the operations side of the house, they'll get paid faster and they'll get paid more because it's impacting the revenue generation side. And so there are groups that do appear to be explicitly targeting the industrial side of these companies, even though the malware itself and the operations they do may look very similar to what's happening in IT. But the impact, of course, is much more significant. So lots of very interesting things. The other thing, of course, just on the positive side, the US government and the Biden administration ended up launching the first ever ICS National Security Memorandum and kicking off some of these 100-day plans started in electric. And without rehashing that, because I've talked about that pretty widely before and have other webinars and similar on that, one of the things that I'll note that's actually really important for our community is for years, executives have talked about how do we increase the cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure. But they've never had to say, do ICS or IT. They just said, go reduce cyber risk. And what we have seen over the past year is in the US and Singapore and the UK and Australia and Saudi Arabia, all around the world, executives and really national level leaders are becoming more and more aware that they do need to specify, go focus on OT, because an amount of the resources, a large amount of the resources in the security budget are getting dedicated to the enterprise IT security work, not in the operations technology or industrial side by comparison. Additionally, when they get focused on OT, it's typically all preventative. Patch, passwords, access, firewalls, segmentation, stuff like that, leaving us with very little, if any, ability to detect and respond to the things that we see inside those environments. So even that National Security Memorandum wasn't just saying, go focus on ICS. It's even getting specifically on ICS and visibility and detection. Why? Not because of some super scary secret, classified threats, simply as a pendulum swing, as executives and policy leaders realize that we haven't done a lot of those things on the operations side of the house yet. So that's one of the big reasons for that. Cool. Well, to start off, let's start with the threats. Then we'll get into vulnerabilities, and then we'll kind of get into lessons learned in cases and things like that. As we look at threats at Dragos, we track activity groups or threat groups, and think of it as clusters of intrusions, the adversaries, what they do. And we try to focus very heavily on the tactics, techniques, and procedures. I'm not just trying to pass around indicators to people. Sure, you can have them, but it's much more on how do these groups operate? How do we get to a point where we can understand the behaviors of adversaries, not just an IP address or a digital hash, which honestly is probably going to change attack to attack anyways. But we should be able to identify anybody that is abusing native functionality inside of an engineering workstation and modified logic on a safety system. Regardless of who does that, that behavior is something we want to be able to identify. To do that, we track different groups and try to keep aware of them and give a view to people out in our intel reports about what's going on and what to pay attention to. And there's a pretty consistent theme now, especially in the last 5 years, of what happens with these groups and kind of their focus. And so we tend to put them into kind of 3 categories. Starting off, forgetting the categories for a second, but just starting off, to be tracked as a threat group at Dragos, there must be the intent, opportunity, or capability focused on the industrial side of the house. So what does that mean? It means if you're a pharmaceutical company or a food and beverage company and a adversary starts sending you phishing emails and trying to get into your company, that doesn't necessarily qualify. In the world of threats, there's hundreds of threat groups out there that target companies. Some smaller subset of those are those that target industrial companies. And there's some smaller subset that are targeting your industrial companies because of their industrial operations, right? There's plenty of companies that get hit by adversaries that are doing criminal activities or espionage or things that has nothing to do with your industrial organization. So just because it's an intrusion or a compromise at a power company or food and beverage company does not mean it's of interest to us. It's of interest to a lot of other people. You should go focus on that work. But for us, it's got to be ICS focused in some nature. That does not mean it has to be in the ICS yet, though. So it's got to be ICS focused. And then it falls into one of 3 categories. The first category are the groups that we're really not all that concerned about. They're at the starting point of their journey, right? They are interested in trying to get into industrial environments, but they're not there yet. So in other words, adversaries that might be compromising the IT networks of a power company, searching for engineering access points, credentials related to engineers and operators, stealing out engineering documents. It's very clearly that they're there for the industrial portion of the company, but they're not in the industrial networks yet. They pose no industrial security risk yet, but they're groups that you should pay attention to and track and try to keep them out of the industrial networks. That category 2 are those that have made it into the industrial networks, but are not being disruptive or destructive yet. So they're in there either learning and preparing, positioning, or very often doing things like intellectual property theft, trying to figure out how are you using your industrial automation environment efficiently. How could they knock that off? What are trade secrets for your company? Things that are housed in the industrial side of the house. Then the third and final group are those that have actually done disruptive or destructive actions. They've kind of gone the distance, if you will. And as we look across those categories, the trend that we see are those that start in the third camp, if you will. So the first camp of interested but not really capable yet. Those end up progressing over the years, and groups that historically weren't even getting access in ICS networks, give it a year or 2 later, they're getting access. 3 or 4 years later, they're becoming capable of actually doing disruptive effects. So from our point of view, there's a theme here where once an adversary determines we're interested in targeting ICS, there's a multi-year journey for them to be the types of threats we really worry about. From like the types of destructive and disruptive actions we often hear about. Why that's important is it gives us an opportunity to prepare security ahead of time in a nice kind of hurricane pathway of where are we going over the next couple of years? Because you're not going to do an industrial security project in a 6-month period like you could do in the enterprise. A lot of these programs can take years to build out your industrial security footprint and all the different investments you want to make. The other benefit that we see in being able to kind of forecast this out and follow it along is we're getting a much better view into what industries are getting hit that normally we wouldn't have as much insight to. So what do I mean by that? I mean that a lot of the historical understanding of industrial threats was energy. Oh, they're going after power and oil and gas. But when we start getting into other industries and mining and food and beverage and pharmaceuticals, we start seeing threats and adding them to the list. So what's happening? In our analysis, a lot of the industries that were the most targeted were actually just some of the more mature industries that were looking more, so they were finding more. And a lot of the industries that aren't doing things like monitoring inside their industrial networks just don't see things that are happening today. So what that says to me is, as I've said before, sometimes we have the equivalency of like Schrodinger's ICS. We're just not looking inside the box to see really what's going on. As the community gets more mature, gets more monitoring, gets more visibility into these networks, we'll end up seeing more and more threats. At this point, though, generally 3 to 4 groups a year we end up finding and progressing along that view. So here's the new ones for this year. This year, we added 3 new activity groups. And if you'll notice off on the right, we talk about things in the ICS cyber kill chain. That's a paper Mike Asante and I wrote. It's available on the SANS ICS website. What we consider stage 1 is adversaries trying to target the industrial side of the house, but they're not in the industrial networks. Stage 2 falls in that second camp of you made it into the industrial networks, and now you're in that developed stage of figuring out what you want to do or how you want to do it. Stage 3 is when they get down to that execute ICS attack, and they've shown the ability and capability to do disruptive or destructive actions. So this year we ended up having 2 stage 2 groups and 1 stage 1 group that we discovered. So the first one is probably the most interesting, in my opinion, and probably the most concerning. So Petrovite is a group, and it has some overlaps with one of the UNC groups tracked out there. We say overlaps because we don't know if there's a one-to-one relationship, but there's technical overlaps with other groups that are tracked. And we ended up finding this group based off an incident response case that we got called into. I'm not going to talk about their case and their details, but that's where this discovery was made by actually responding to one of the compromises in a power company. And as we then sort of pivoted out from there, we were able to get a broader view of Petrovite and what they're doing. And so one of the very interesting things is they're really, really careful and highly disciplined on their operational security. What that means to us is using dedicated infrastructure for victims, being very stealthy in the way they approach things. It's not a spray and pray kind of operation. It's really being honed in on here's who we're going to target, and we're going to use very specific infrastructure for just that one victim. Again, things like indicator sharing would therefore be useless. And they have the capability of using zero-day exploits against network appliances like Pulse Secure and the different ones that folks use for remote access or segmentation for these industrial networks. In this group, they specifically have been going after a number of global renewable energy companies. As an example, they can compromise a equipment manufacturer or maintenance provider for a bunch of different renewable companies, get in, pivot down into the actual SCADA and control side of the house on those renewable wind and solar companies. And then from our analysis, what they were doing was positioning on the actual control side of the house, but not doing things that would be of intellectual property value. So I want to be careful in this next statement, but this is important, where nothing we saw indicates that there was any value to what they were doing for intellectual property or similar. Everything we saw was the type of activity. We're not saying they got there, but it's the type of activity that you would do to be on systems for future disruptive operations. So we are not saying they were trying to take down power systems. What we were saying is they successfully compromised power systems down onto the operations and industrial side of the house, getting to that stage 2, and the type of work they were doing and the places they were on was exactly where you would be and exactly what you'd be doing for future disruptive operations. Whether they had the intent to take it that far or not, you'd have to ask them. But in terms of their capabilities, they're there. And to me, this was a pretty concerning operation because it's the first time in quite a while that we've seen an adversary getting into the position with the potential intent to actually take down or disrupt electric operations. So quite interesting. And I think as we look at how we transform the electric sector of the future, anyways, across various countries, I think we should expect to see much more activity happening in these renewable energy resources, especially just because of the interconnected nature of them. This group ended up compromising a couple different providers, a couple different sites, I should say. And in doing so, we're able to get into industrial operations on 2 different continents. So without getting into the specifics of cases and the victims, I would say it reveals kind of those trust chains, especially between these interconnected energy resources, which honestly is the trend for most of the energy resources out there. So as an example of what they would do, which actually is quite clever, of course, compromising an energy organization, usually targeting the appliances directly, not phishing and all that other stuff, but targeting the appliances that were being used for either segmentation or remote access directly, stealing credentials and things inside those environments and moving east-west, kind of moving laterally into those operations networks. Everything they did was living off the land. That means is they're not using specific custom malware. They're not using things that are going to pop on antivirus or EDR or anything like that. It is using all the native tools in the environment to be stealthy and to do their operations in such a way that'd be very difficult to detect off endpoint protections and things like that. And from those compromises, into maintenance providers and service providers being able to get down directly into the generation facilities of various renewable assets across the world. So a good example of compromising a supplier and pivoting out to their customers, and also just, again, consistent actions and being able to get in on positioning into energy resources, especially on the renewable side of the house. So the next one we have was Petrovite. So Petrovite was just on the stage 1 side of the house, so trying to get into ICS networks, but not there yet. Okay. We ended up discovering them last year, but we've seen that they've been in operation since 2019. They do have overlaps with the group we track as Comicite, and they do have overlaps with the group CrowdStrike tracks as Fancy Bear. Again, we're not saying there's one-to-ones. When we say there's overlaps, we're just saying based on technical details that are public, based on tactics, techniques, procedures, there's overlaps here. They may be similar groups, they may be overlaps, but the way each company defines groups and how they do that, there is no one-to-one coordination there, but there are overlaps to be able to point people in that direction. In terms of this group, obviously, again, they're not in the ICS networks yet, but what we consistently saw was them going after critical manufacturing, energy, and mining resources, especially in Central Asia, and seeing a pretty strong focus on trying to get into the ICS networks of those companies. So they'll break into the corporate IT side of the house and try to find access and pivot into the operations side of the house, again, especially in these mining, energy, and critical infrastructure resources. What they were doing, which was pretty interesting, was, again, a lot of compromising those third-party infrastructure and hosting up things like WordPress servers, which were going to be delivering capabilities back into the enterprise. A lot of compromised victim servers actually being in countries like Kazakhstan. So stage 1, somebody to track. They're in that first group of interesting. We track them. We want to see how they develop. We want to make sure that you're protecting your enterprise networks against them, because it's an ICS focused threat that you might find in the enterprise, but they're not an ICS net yet. Nothing to get alarmed about from the ICS side of the house. But if you're an enterprise IT defender and you're at a critical manufacturing, energy, or mining company and you see this type of group, that should get a different priority in terms of what you're dealing with on IT security based on their historical targeting and trying to get into those operations side of the house. The third and final one from this past year was Etherite. So Eartherite, I should say, we found them last year, but they've been operating since 2020. There's not any links to known groups, not strong links to known groups. However, there does appear to be overlaps with something tracked as Solar Marker out in the community. So we don't know it's the same group, but there's technical overlaps. And what was really interesting about them is these folks were extremely clever in doing SEO poisoning of various websites and infrastructure, so that as people went out and try to Google for something or use their favorite resource to do searching on the web, search engine optimization, SEO poisoning would get them to websites that they thought they were going to with legitimate purposes, but now they're pulling down WordPress files, PDFs, malicious software, et cetera, off of that SEO poisoning. So companies getting compromised kind of from the web, from web applications on the IT side of the house, opening up access to the adversaries, then the adversary, in this case, this group, pivoting from the IT side of the house into the OT side of the house. And we worked incident response cases where we found them on the operations side of the house. Thus, they're a stage 2 group, and getting us in, especially on manufacturing facilities. There was some electric utilities and so forth, but a big focus in manufacturing. In fact, according to everything we can find access to, around 20% of the Fortune 500 companies were compromised, which is, of course, pretty significant in terms of scope. So this group is, again, somebody that you would expect to find in the IT networks to start with. But the moment they're in those IT networks, they're trying to get into the operations side of the house and have shown that they are capable of doing that. We don't know what their intention is on the operations side of the house. Luckily, the firms that have been compromised or engaged with us or others were really quick. That's good. But somebody to track, as now they are capable of getting the operations side of the house. And again, have been pretty successful in compromising a number of pretty large companies. As those companies get better visibility into the operations side of the house, that's where we'll hear and see more over time. So those are the first 3 to go through here. The other updates, again, the report has a ton of more insights, but I wanted to give a quick update on some of the existing groups that we track, not the new players, but some of the existing ones. And I think there's some interesting takeaways that I want to highlight for folks. One of the groups that we talked about discovering last year with Stibnite. So Stibnite, in my opinion, is a super interesting group to track because I don't think a lot of people get its relevance on the first pass. It's a group that's not in OT yet. They're at stage one, trying to find OT. They were targeting wind energy and solar energy kind of resources in Azerbaijan. Why is that interesting? Because there are no active wind energy resources in Azerbaijan. So you sit back the first time, you're like, what? Hold on. So group is targeting wind energy, but there's not active wind energy operations. Like, how's that line up? Well, Azerbaijan had messaged a couple of years ago that they're going to try to diversify their energy resources and stop relying on certain neighboring countries for fuel imports, natural gas, et cetera. They wanted to become energy independent. And so they started investing heavily in wind energy resources. The moment that they were saying, we're done using certain countries' energy resources, we started seeing this group spin up and start targeting every research organization, manufacturer, OEM, contractor, et cetera, related to those wind energy resources. So this, in my opinion, is so interesting because it is really left of boom, if you will, of seeing an adversary targeting industrial operations from the ground up, trying to get in as those assets come online and get built, trying to gain access and trying to be in there from a foothold from the very beginning. It's a very interesting case. And I think as we look at what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and across Europe, as various European entities try to diversify their fuel sources and not rely on things like Russian gas, I think this is a great example of things that could come to bear where we start seeing adversaries go after those energy resources as a reciprocal action from diversifying energy resources. Basically, the idea of countries getting energy independence can be a very heated topic, especially when you are trying to not rely on certain countries like Russian fuel sources. And so they can still remain active in targeting those wind energy resources. Comosite is another really interesting group. If you remember the 2016 attack on Ukraine's electric system, there's essentially two groups responsible with that. Comosite is the group that targets the enterprise side of the house to get access to the operations side of the house, but then they hand off to Electrum, which is the group that we track that was actually responsible for creating the crash override malware and taking down the electric site in 2016. What's interesting about Comosite is they're an access development team. And there's not a lot of public examples of that. They have technical overlaps with the Sandworm group, and there's been a lot of great work on that. But what's quite interesting, again, with Comosite is they're people that you would expect to see in the enterprise. But when you see them, it is because they are trying to get access to the OT side of the house to hand off to other groups like Electrum. They are also involved in and responsible with Black Energy 2, Black Energy 3 malware, and in this case, also being involved in the gray energy malware. What we thought was interesting this past year is we saw new gray energy files being discovered in the wild, showing active and ongoing development on capabilities by Comosite. So they're still active and still looking to get into locations. So somebody to be aware of. And then lastly, on Wassenite, this is a group that had previously been disclosed by us and talked about publicly on targeting nuclear power and electric sites, especially in India. And they had previously compromised the IT networks of a nuclear power company in India with targeting focus towards the operations side of the house, though they did not get into the operations side of the house. So again, a stage one adversary trying to get into the operations side of the house, going after nuclear energy resources, especially in India. And we just continue to see them trying to get access to those sites. And so again, if you're trying to take the indicators of compromise from Wassenite and apply it to an energy resource in Europe, Australia, GCC, United States, whatever, that's not very valuable. The indicators are not going to overlap. You're not going to see their command and control server, very realistically. But how they're trying to get in, how they're trying to accomplish it, how they're trying to get access, those tactics, techniques, and behaviors or procedures, those behaviors, those are the things that we can all learn from and make sure that we're improving our security as a result. So at this point, I'll pivot into the vulnerability section. I already see a bunch of questions coming in, which is awesome. I'll get to those at the end, so please keep them coming. So that was our threat update piece. Again, lots more in the report and a deeper dive and a follow-on webinar. But let's talk about vulnerabilities for a second. It is very common for security professionals to go into the operations side of the house and immediately focus on vulnerabilities. Oh my gosh, it's a Windows XP system, or oh, it's still a Windows 7 system, or so forth and so on. And while there are some vulnerabilities that really matter, and it is good to be aware of plenty of them, the value proposition is just different. In IT security, finding and fixing vulnerabilities is a main, sort of stay of doing InfoSec. On the OT side of the house, there's a lot that just don't really matter. And we want to make sure we're not disrupting operations or spending up our people about things that aren't really introducing risk. So the state of industrial vulnerabilities is way different than the state of IT vulnerabilities. As an example, we found that with the vulnerabilities that were released last year, which was almost double the previous year, just there's been a hockey stick increase the number of vulnerabilities getting disclosed. About 23% of them were kind of the bordering the enterprise, like a historian or an access point in. 77% of them were kind of deep inside the ICS networks, PLCs, RTUs, engineering workstations, things like that. We apply just a really simple analysis. For every single vulnerability, our intel team goes through, looks at it, analyzes it, corrects incorrect data, and classifies it on the operations side of the house. Because it's something like a CVSS, those little scores, like a 9.3, really irrelevant to the operations impact. And what we found is that in 2021, which is the white bar there, the top bar for anybody colorblind. So the top bar there, 63% of the vulnerabilities didn't have a loss of view or a loss of control impact. There was no impact. The 63% of the time, those vulnerabilities had no ability to impact operations. However, we found that 35% of them had the ability to do both a loss of view and a loss of control. So as we think about trying to take a risk-based approach, there's 63% of vulnerabilities that are off into the side that get to them if you ever have time. The main focus is, hey, what are those 35% that can actually cause loss of view and loss of control? We also found over the last 3 years that there's just been a consistent theme in inaccuracies inside of these advisories. Last year in 2021, 38% of the advisories released had incorrect data, wrong hardware, wrong software, wrong vulnerability, wrong scoring. Something was wrong 38% of the time with the advisories, which makes it very difficult for defenders to actually leverage those to do anything meaningful whatsoever. We also found that just from a scoring perspective, we go and fix the scores, and we found that 52% of the time when we fixed the scores, it was more severe than the advisor was making it out to be. 45%, it was less severe, and then 3%, it was identical, but for different reasons. The exploitation vector or something was actually wrong on the advisory, even though the scoring came out correctly. So again, without trying to poke anybody, the state of our industrial advisories and vulnerabilities is really bad in terms of accuracy. Some vendors are much better than others. Some vendors in their certs have invested a lot. Some of the OEMs, not so much. So it's a mixed bag. It's not trying to say 38% of any one of your favorite vendors, but across the community, 38% incorrect data. We also found another troubling stat, which has been consistent over the years, which is when these advisories get published, all right, 76% of the advisories had a patch. 24% of those advisories, though, did not have a patch. And of those advisories, 19% of them had no practical mitigation. What does that mean? It means you get an advisory saying, you're vulnerable. Cool. What do I do about it? We don't know. That's not exactly actionable guidance for people to take advantage of. So 24% of the time, there's no patch, and 19% of those, no mitigation whatsoever. In the 76 that had a patch, 64% of them had no mitigation. So it was patch it or don't, even though patching can be one of the most disruptive or least likely capabilities you can use to mitigate a vulnerability. So again, with each one of these vulnerabilities, we try to go add this context in, and we mapped it not only on our Intel reports, we mapped it for our technology as well, because our technology does the kind of the visibility detection and vulnerability management work inside of ICS. And in this case, we just mapped those two together for what guidance we're giving people. And we found that across all the 2021 vulnerabilities, 4% of them were things that you should remediate, generally thinking like patching. So only 4% of the time are we telling people it's probably pretty important to actually patch this. 53% of the time we're saying you should mitigate it, but the mitigation could be a firewall adjustment. It could be a disabling a port. It could be just taking action on a certain service that's actually not critical to the operations. So only 4% of the time should you actually, based on our guidance, really be bothering people to go patch stuff. 53% of the time, there's much simpler, easy mitigations you can put in place. 34% of the time, it's just monitoring it for exploitation. It's like, dude, you don't need to do anything. You just need to be able to monitor it, get east-west traffic analysis, and be able to see if something is actually going wrong with it. And 9% of the time, you should just ignore them completely. That it's completely hyped up a wrong vulnerability and not worth your time at all. When we think about some of the friction that can form between IT and OT, a lot of time it's on, hey, there's this vulnerability, go find it and fix it. And that's not arming our operations side of the house to do good work. And it's really just creating unnecessary friction. So for the security team to be able to stand in front of that and say, actually, only 4% of the time we're going to come to you and tell you that you need to patch something. 53% of the time, we'll try to be non-intrusive and just do a small mitigation. 34% of the time, we're doing nothing at all, but we'll monitor for you. And 9%, we're just completely taking off the plate. That's an awesome opportunity to show value by removing work and workload from people that actually isn't increasing the security of your company. So moving from vulnerabilities into lessons learned from the customer engagements, across the years, there's been some pretty consistent trends again. And this represents customers that come to us for the first time, starting up with one of our service engagements to then later go and do our technology. And we find that people sit in consistent camps, which is actually really good. It means we're all going down the same journey. It means there's kind of some repeatable patterns here and lessons learned. And it means we can get to some really solid guidance that's scalable across the community. And that helps us get to a state where defense is really doable. All right. So the first category there, we saw limited to no visibility in OT environments. In this case, it's showing 38% there, but that's from repeat. It was actually quite a bit higher. It would have been 86. So a change of -4, 86% of the time as it relates to new customers, 38% as they're kind of going down their journey. So about 86% of the time when people come to us, they have limited to no visibility whatsoever in their operations environment. And that goes back to that very beginning slide when I was talking about ICS National Security Memorandum and executives and world leaders realizing we've got a lot of prevention, but not a lot of detection and response. Those are the kind of stats that honestly validate that point of view, where we as a community have done a lot of good security work, but it's been very prevention focused. And if you're going to actually ever be able to detect and respond to threats, as well as just maintenance events and things that happen that aren't necessarily even cyber related in the growing industrial, automation environments we have, you got to be able to have the right visibility to be able to troubleshoot things, detect threats, respond to them, et cetera. As it relates to poor security perimeters, down about 11%, so 77% in total. But across all the customers' engagements, about 77% of them have very porous security perimeters. So if you think about it, one of the number one controls that everybody does is try to get segmentation or good security perimeter. And then we all kind of appreciate that once you get past the perimeter, it's that GUI inside, crunchy outside, GUI inside. And we got to do better to get inside network monitoring. But what we find is all those investments still about 77% of the time, it's very porous. Any rules left forever, wide open communications, wide open ports, the ability to egress and ingress relatively easily. We're not using the tools we have effectively to get all the security value out of them, let alone then going down into the operations environments. In terms of external connections to OT, as you might imagine, because of the pandemic and remote operations, we saw a pretty big spike in that, where 70% of all the operations, technology, and industrial environments we went into, 70% of them had external remote connections. So like bidirectional kind of remote connections coming in and out of those operations environments. Largely, my point here is there's a lot of companies that still believe they're disconnected or air gapped. I don't know why that still comes up, but people believe it. And it's just not true. Save yourself the assessment. It's not true. Even if you don't have connections from OT to IT, you've got connections from OT to somebody else's IT, right? The maintenance providers, the remote workers, the personnel, the original equipment manufacturers, the suppliers, diagnostics and monitoring, connectivities there. And then we found in 44% of the cases, shared IT and OT credentials across the environments. Very commonly, we'll see things like an Active Directory environment in IT that's being shared across the operations environment. And that is one of the biggest reasons that we get called in for ransomware cases is when somebody pops the Active Directory in IT, rides that thing like a highway of death right down to the operations environment, spreads throughout the operations environments, whether or not the adversary intended to. So the shared IT and OT credentials, especially the shared authorization piece of it, is something to pay very close attention to as well. So here's a little break from the details to get into an incident response case study. This one was really, really fun. We obviously can't talk in depth about incident response cases where there were adversaries. We refer to them with the threat groups and similar. The incident response cases we can talk about, though, and get permission to talk about are those related to when it wasn't an adversary. And I find these to be even more interesting. Obviously, everybody geeks out about adversaries and trying to chase them down, and we should do that. But I love it when cybersecurity investments can show resilience value to our operations side of the house. It's a great way to help bridge those divides between IT and OT. So in this case, we worked with a phenomenal company, did all the right things. It was a power generation site. The the fairly large plant. Plant was down for maintenance, and operators and engineers, right, going and do their maintenance work. And the generator kicked on its own, right? So the power generation site came to life, right? Came on its own. Of course, that should not happen. It scared the hell out of everybody, right? It's not a good thing for that to take place. And then the industrial engineering and operations side of the house started trying to do root cause analysis of this facility. The security team, in collaboration with the operations team, did the right thing, activated an incident response retainer. We went in to respond, started validating, hey, is there something at the transmission system operator level? Is there something on the automatic generation control? Like trying to troubleshoot what was going on. And eventually getting to the point that it didn't look like anything was remote and some cyber adversary. So we kind of started going more in towards the operations side of the house, and deeper into the operations networks, I should say. And some really clever work by our incident responders, one of which Leslie Carhart actually led this one, and they did a phenomenal job with it, where the investigation led them to say, well, I think there's commands coming from the HMI that are kicking off the control loop of the generator. And this HMI was in a remote shed of sorts. Shed's kind of a maybe more derogatory than it actually is, but kind of shed-like structure. And what Leslie noticed was the human machine interface was a touchscreen human machine interface. And it looked like there was kind of some smudges on the HMI. So they wanted to be able to do forensics and try to identify, hey, what's going on in the system? But for various regulatory reasons, you can't just go and add random software to every asset around there. So they were not able to do anything that wasn't already a native tool on the HMI. This led to some of the best out-of-the-box thinking I've ever seen in incident response, where Leslie ended up noting that Windows Paint is assigned binary. Would there be any warranty or regulatory concerns about having Windows Paint up on the system? Everyone's like, no, why? And then it kind of dawned on everybody. Leslie loaded up Windows Paint on the system, left for a little bit, came back and found swipes across the screen that were obviously the swipes that were kicking off the HMI and the control loop. And what it was moisture was getting onto the HMI. That moisture with a overpressurized touchscreen HMI was what was causing a click-like function. Those click-like functions are the right locations on the HMI at the wrong time, kicked off a control loop to power the generator when it was down for maintenance. Just wow. So super cool work by the engineers and operators and security team at that company. They're going to remain nameless, but they are phenomenal people. Great out of the box incident response work by Leslie. And then one of the things here that I want to highlight is the growing complexity of industrial automation. If you think 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there were engineers and operators in our plants and in our companies that knew anything and everything about that plant, knew anything and everything about that manufacturing line. But as a lot of that expertise leaves the workforce, as a lot of more automation comes in place, as a lot more complex automation comes in place, value chain with more suppliers and so forth, people are losing knowledge of the whole system and learning pieces and sub-pieces of the system. What that means is things like root cause analysis and being resilient regardless of reasons is becoming more and more difficult in the system of systems world. And as a result, things like network monitoring to be able to see commands coming off an HMI, going and activating a generation capacity outside of a maintenance window or inside of a maintenance window, those are things where things like network security and monitoring can not only be useful for cybersecurity, but also just the root cause analysis and troubleshooting ability inside of operations. So a wonderful case study in many, many ways. Additional lessons learned, we did assessments across just about every sector last year. And we tried to summarize all the different findings that we have into a nice little heat map to try to draw out trends across the different industries. And the ones that we talked about earlier, external connectivity, shared credentials, poor perimeters, limited visibility, that's kind of the buckets we put it into by the different sectors that we get involved in. And what we found is at least 50% of the customers in all verticals had significant issues with both network perimeters and visibility. So they're not as strong on the prevention aspect as they thought they were, and they have limited to no visibility inside the ICS. Again, that goes back to the Schrodinger's ICS aspect. We're just not looking, so we're not seeing a lot of the things that are actually happening. Another very common finding is that 4 findings are prevalent and exist in more than 70% of the water, food and beverage, and wind industries. So in other words, all 4 findings were large findings in at least 70% of the clients in those industries. And then shared credentials between IT and OT is the least consistent findings across verticals. So there's some verticals that seem to really struggle with that, some that don't struggle with it at all. So that one's the least consistent. The limited visibility is the most consistent, and the poor perimeters would be the next most consistent across any industry. So hopefully this gives just a pretty good understanding of how common it is to find certain findings. And again, the report goes into much more detail about these as well. So another incident response case, again, to talk about that kind of root cause analysis aspect, but also the relationships with the original equipment manufacturers and vendors. This was another non-cyber adversary one, but it got our attention pretty quick because a power company in some country, doesn't matter, and this is another company that did all the right things. And like, I wish we as a community felt a little bit more comfortable about calling out company names, because again, this team that we worked with in the company just nailed it across every line. But what ended up happening is they had some commands that got sent to some of the RTUs that ended up changing, try not to get into too much of the details here, ended up changing the electric portion of the system. In other words, actually having like actual changes on the electric system that they did not do. That is a terrifying scenario. And in many ways, it was very reminiscent of what we saw in the 2015 Ukraine attack, of an adversary getting on a distribution management system or a SCADA system and being able to send native functionality and commands to cycle RTUs. So it was something that rightfully got a lot of attention. Activated the incident response retainer. In this case, we were able to deploy our technology out throughout the environment, which gave us that network visibility in the commands. From there, we were able to see that one of the ICS protocols was actually generating these commands on the RTUs and changing set points. And when we looked, it was coming from a specific SCADA system, if you will. So that was able to hone everybody and focus everybody on exactly where to go instead of trying to do forensics across everything. It was, hey, this system and these systems, these are what's in scope. Where to identify the commands, get the data, start doing the analysis on the software, start doing the analysis on the host. And in this case, the original equipment manufacturer, the OT vendor, was extremely helpful. They didn't dodge the discussion at all. They were right in trying to do the good and the right things. And they found that there was actually a programming error that was on the SCADA software that they had developed. And it was just a software bug that was sending out the wrong commands to the RTUs, causing change across the electric system. So again, thinking about the growing complexity of industrial automation, that system to systems interaction, it was really that ICS network visibility, getting into the ICS protocols, working hand in hand with the asset owner and operator, as well as the OT vendor, to really just troubleshoot this whole thing. And it was awesome to see. Otherwise, it would have been a lot longer investigation, a lot more impactful, I would say, based on not being able to get to root cause analysis quickly. So as we start winding it down, just got a couple more slides here. I want to focus a little bit on ransomware, just because it was such a trend last year in terms of what we're seeing. Again, time and time again, people think they have a better security than they do. They're getting hit with ransomware, and it's a very emotional day for a lot of folks. So what we found is ransomware shot to the top of the list in terms of the number one attack vector in industrial, and really interestingly, majorly in manufacturing. So there was a couple cases, especially on the operations side of the house, in electric power and oil and gas and others. I don't think there's a lot of public commentary about these things. I know there's not, but they are impacting on the operations side of the house across every industry. But manufacturing really got taken advantage of last year by these groups, with 211 of the cases just being in the manufacturing industry alone. And that's even before you break out like pharmaceutical and food and beverage into different types of manufacturing. So kind of general purpose manufacturing, top of the list. Metal products, as an example, was the biggest one. And in those cases, it was very obvious when 90% of the cases had extremely limited visibility or logging or data collection in those environments. And I don't want to keep hammering that too much, but the reason this is so important is in IT, just based on the modern systems and logging and native systems, you can kind of get through an incident response without preparing. Preparation is super important, but you can still accomplish your objectives in IT without fully preparing. In operations technology environments, industrial systems, the types of systems, the data collection requirements, the timing considerations of them, et cetera, it's very difficult to do incident response without a lot of preparation. And there'll be questions and legal and financial and executive level insights and questions that you may have for regulatory, legal, financial, liability purposes, whatever, you just can't even answer unless you prepared correctly ahead of time. So just consistently, people had worse network segmentation and preparation and prevention capabilities than they thought, and little to no visibility whatsoever, which really exacerbated these issues. A good example, what really happens with these ransomware groups is they break in, it's human operating ransomware. They're not throwing ransomware the moment that they get in. They're often in there for days or weeks before they pick out all the right targets to then ransom. Those days and weeks are where we really should be on top of this as security professionals to make sure that we keep our companies up and running. Now, when we look at ransomware, though, a lot of folks try to target and focus on every single ransomware group out there. And that's really missing the boat, especially with the indicators. Oh, what are the indicators of CLOP as an example? And it's like, guys, you don't want to deal with 30 million technical indicators. I'm not saying indicators are bad, but they're really there for forensic tools, not detection tools half the time. Okay. They're okay to lean on, they're okay to use, but it shouldn't be the preeminent portion of your strategy. What we find across all the ransomware groups is there's a couple tactics, techniques, and procedures that are consistent around file exchanges and lateral movement and so forth. So even just a couple really good behavioral detections on the cross TTPs are enough to help you across all the different groups instead of chasing every single group. That being said, if you're going to focus on anybody, I'd focus on Lockbit 2.0 and Conti, because those two groups made up 51% of all of the ransomware cases that we're aware of that impacted these industrial companies. 70% of their malicious activities in general targeted manufacturing companies. And we've seen Conti and others talk about picking sides in the Russia-Ukraine war, in the Russian invasion, and trying to target infrastructure companies. So if I was in manufacturing right now of any type, I mean, it's appropriate for any company, but especially in manufacturing, I'd be making sure that I understand what would a Conti or Lockbit 2 style ransomware attack look like on our operations side of the house. And let's make sure we can get ready for it the best we can, but try to be able to detect and respond to it at a minimum. All right, and that leads us to the controls, and then leaves me a couple of minutes as well to ask questions. So based on all of the insights we have, based on all the cases we worked, we try to get down to what are the most impactful security controls that you can implement to really raise the bar. I think when people look at operations, technology, and industrial control systems to start with, they start freaking out. They go, oh my gosh, I have so much work to do. But the reality is you should not, and you do not need to be copy and pasting all the things you do in IT security over to OT security. I see all sorts of discussions about what about this and this and this product category. Most of it's kind of irrelevant. So I'm not saying that they're all bad investments, but they are much lower return on investments. If you did these 5 things, especially at your actual critical sites, think top 50% of your company sites as an example, if you did these 5 things, you would have a world-class OT security program. Number 1, get a defensible architecture. That could be microsegmentation, software-defined networks, firewalls, whatever, but an environment that is not only defensible and reduces some of those common risks, but also facilitates the data collection and the insights for you to be able to add human defenders. Because remember, you don't have a defended architecture, you have a defensible architecture. Then you add the human component to make it a defended architecture. But if you have flat networks with unmanaged switches, sorry, you're not getting data collection. There's nothing they're going to be able to do with that for defending it. It's an indefensible architecture. So a defensible architecture is something that helps reduce a significant amount of the risk just based on the prevention that you're putting in place, especially around things like segmentation and network prevention, and facilitates the addition of human defenders based on the data collection and needs that they have. The second one is ICS network monitoring. Being able to understand what's going on in those ICS protocols and communications and that system-to-system interaction. And that's a big focus of what OT is and why it's so different than IT, is it's the physical world and it's the system-to-system interactions. Compromising an engineer workstation and make a change to the logic on a PLC in such a way that impacts the valve, right? System 1 plus system 2 equates impact on system 3. That's not a host-based focus. That's a systems of systems analysis. That's network monitoring. That's network communications. And regardless of what vendor you choose, whether it's Dragos or anybody else, so many in the market have asset ID, vulnerability identification, threat detection, et cetera, all in that one control. So it's a big bang for your buck. Number 3 is remote access authentication wherever possible. And this is a classic IT security control, but it actually applies really well with tailoring, and that is multi-factor authentication. You have more remote access than you realize down the operations side of the house. If you can roll out multi-factor authentication on those access points, phenomenal, major risk reduction. If you can't, leaning back to the defensible architecture and figuring out things like jump posts and additional monitoring is the compensating control. So trying to figure out where you can and can't provide it. I'm not worried about inter-network communications. I'm not worried about putting remote access controls from an HMI to a PLC. I'm worried about the remote access portion of this, which leads me to number 4, which is a key vulnerability management program. I do not want you chasing around all 100% of the vulnerabilities that come out. You're going to waste your time. You're going to really tick off your operations staff. I want you to focus on what are the ones that we said you got to mitigate and remediate. What's that 4% and what's that kind of 30-something% or 40% of vulnerabilities that you need to do something about based on an actual understanding of how they can operate and impact in the industrial environments. Just taking care of those are the key ones. And you should focus on the perimeter side of it to start with. Whereas the access points, whereas a historian bridging the IT to OT, whereas the systems that are communicating up to corporate or out to vendors, that can take a wide range. It's not just historians. Sometimes you'll see things like turbine control software being interacted with an OEM for diagnostics and performance monitoring. But wherever we see those crossing the boundaries and kind of the remote piece of it, whether it's to your own IT or to somebody else's, that's where you should start with, and then get in following the guidance on, cool, what are the ones that we need to mitigate and remediate? Things that are monitoring the rest of it, don't worry about those. Just let the monitoring and the other controls you have help you out. You should not be chasing a firmware vulnerability in an RTAC or a firmware vulnerability in a digital relay. That doesn't really make sense. And then lastly, you need to have an ICS specific incident response plan. Please do not depend on your IT incident response plan for your ICS. Get a Dragos or somebody else. I'm not trying to just pitch here. Get somebody who has experience actually doing incident response in ICS. We worked a case this year, which is in the report, where an IT company with no ICS experience tried to respond to a power generation company that got compromised, screwed up the case so badly that I think they did more damage than the adversary, and it lost tons of time, resources, and effort until we came in as the second team to have to clean up and actually try to answer the questions they had. So you need to have an ICS specific incident response plan that helps you figure out and coordinate between IT and OT staffs, who's the points of contact, what are the requirements ahead of time. That's going to drive the collection and data that we have, as well as use cases around detections. It's going to be an overall strategy you need to put in place. And I would try to do things like tabletop exercises to actually rehearse and plan with that. So with that, I'll go over to answering the questions and try to get through as many as I can here in the last couple of minutes. But the full report is over at dragos.com/YIR. Hopefully you enjoy it. So let's see. Fair to say, not if, but when attacks will cross over and affect OT and ICS in the US, already happening. You're not talking about taking down the power grid. Remember, there's more than one electric system in the United States anyways. But more often than not, a lot of the stuff we're talking about was in the US. There's more and more compromise than people realize. Please discuss how you're seeing changes in like hygiene and kind of the hygiene of what's happening in the OT environments. Again, based on our view, the starting point for companies is pretty much consistent across the years. Once people get started, they start making significant changes. And we see sort of the second and third and fourth year customers on their journey have significantly enhanced their security. Let's see. 2021 brought what I believe was the first USA ICS regulatory action, TSSD2. We speak to this regulation as affecting those who fall into the scope. It wasn't the first. There's a bunch of regulations in the US like NERC-CIP and NRC and so forth, but it was the first ICS regulations for pipeline operations. While I think the TSA has a lot of good people, and I think that they were in a really rough spot, I want to pull no punches when I say TSSD2 regulation was the worst regulation I've ever seen created. If you were to actually follow SD2's guidance fully, you would bring down your pipeline operations. It's a lot of copy and paste IT stuff. It's overly prescriptive in some areas, overly vague in others. Do orchestration, but patch these system vulnerabilities. It's all over the place. Again, while I appreciate the TSA was in a rough spot, I really hope we get to a formal rules making process soon, because it is a pretty awful regulation. Do threat groups ever drop off that Dragos is tracking if enough time passes? In other words, do they kind of drop off? Yes. So essentially, if we don't see a group remaining active, we'll stop talking about them. The TTPs and things, especially for a customer just going down the first part of their journey, we still want to tell them, hey, they might not be active. Don't worry about the indicators. Go learn the lessons learned that others did. Include that into your lexicon here. but we don't keep updating people on groups that are no longer active. And some do drop off, but some do come back. Exenotime is an example, is the adversary that tried to kill people in a petrochemical facility with the Trisis malware in 2017. For a while, they dropped off. They started coming back around October of last year and being active again. Let's see. A lot of Ukraine stuff. I'm actually covering Ukraine in its entirety this Friday with Tim Conway and Paul Stockton. So for people on the recording, it's another SANS recording that we'll have. So feel free to go do that one, and I'll focus on the Ukraine discussions then. What do you think about rail systems? Do you consider to be OT? Absolutely. Do a lot of work around rail providers as well. And you have everything from positive train control kind of systems on the rail to the control center side of the house as well. But absolutely, it's OT, and they have a lot of the same findings, pretty consistent across industries when people are starting their journey. Question about attribution, like China, Russia, et cetera. We don't do attribution. I'm not at all concerned with the geopolitical nature of it. All we care about is how should you be defending yourself, not who is it. Let's see. All right, lots of good questions here. I'll take a lot of them offline as well. How come we don't see more kinetic outcomes from ICS breaches, assuming capability and opportunity, or is it motivation? So I'll let this be the last one. I'll say that from our view, some of the groups do have the intent, but are just not all that capable, and they've made actions before, but kind of screwed it up. But we've also seen the groups that are very, very capable that are just getting in place for future operations. And with my little bit of my bias on my past in the US intelligence community, I would say that the majority of groups out there would not want to be kinetic or cause a large scale attack to start with, but they are capabilities and access that people want to be able to have for times in conflict. And so I'm usually telling people to stop the hype, calm the FUD, like just dial it down a little bit. The Russian invasion has absolutely gotten all of our attention, and this is the type of time that if things continue to escalate or spill over into NATO countries or so forth, I think there's a lot of concern about what could happen with access that's been maintained over the years. Anyways, awesome questions, awesome interaction. Thanks for sticking around for the webinar. We're going to close it down. Again, the recording and slides will all be available on the same SANS link that you used to register to get here. Please go check out the report, and I'll see you at the Ukraine webinar with Tim Conway, Paul Stockton, and I, or at the webinars that we have on the Dragos.com for breaking into each one of these sections, vulnerabilities, threats, and lessons learned. Hopefully you'll come over and ask the in-depth questions to the security analysts that actually did all this amazing work. I get to present it, but it was my team and all their individual efforts that actually did all this work. I just get to be the fancy talking head. So thanks everybody for the trust. Thanks everybody for your time. And Carol, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Robert, for your great presentation, and to Dragos for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.